My name is Dick McGinn. I'm from Athens. I'm retired professor of linguistics at Ohio University. And as one of our judges has pointed out, I'm working closely with John Howell, with the previous person who gave the testimony. We are involved in two organizations. One is called Democracy Over Corporations that John has founded. The other one is the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, which is CELDEF. We've got 2 or 3 people in this organization, and I see a coalition of organizations working on different levels to attack these problems. But our special concern is the role of democracy and the right of self-determination in a democratic society. And my personal concern today is the Athens County, people of Athens County, whether they have the right to decide for themselves whether to allow frack waste dumping, or whether there is any support for the idea of community rights, that communities have rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. And I'll try to end with that topic. But I have a message for the United Nations and for the world. America is not the champion of the environmental movement. On the contrary, concerned Americans must appeal to the United Nations to point out our national shortcomings, which increasingly our state and federal officials seem totally unable to comprehend. This is what we have been facing in the testimony earlier today. Human rights are intimately associated with independence movements, from Thomas Paine and the American Revolution to the emergence of new nations after World Wars I, World War II, and the Cold War. It is the history of struggle to throw off imperial rule and assert the right to national and local self-determination. In this context, the words of the American Declaration of Independence are echoed in constitution after constitution all over the world, whenever the blessings of freedom and independence are claimed as the universal right of a sovereign people. Not all post-colonial countries have kept their freedoms, however. I lived for 7 years in the 2 poorest countries in Southeast Asia that fell under dictators after throwing off colonial rule: the Philippines under Ferdinand Marcos and Indonesia under General Suharto. 7 uninterrupted years, I should say. I conducted my research there. I became intimately acquainted with friends and colleagues among the indigenous populations. I have former students who were arrested, and some were disappeared. Their protests and their poverty belied the country's rich natural resources. As reported by Professor Elizabeth Collins in her book of Indonesia Betrayed, the exploitation was and still is being carried out in Indonesia, Philippines, and around the world with the assistance and support of United States foreign policy during and after the Cold War. Emerging nations seeking democratic self-determination have been treated as enemies of the West unless they supported the treacherous dichotomy in which capitalism was the only good and neutrality was equated with support for the Soviet plot to take over the world. This is the world I grew up in as a young person. Stephen Kinzer's Overthrow is a book that talks about this. Another one by Kinzer is called The Brothers, I would recommend. The legacy of misguided economic development models was correctly assessed by Pope Francis in Laudato Si. Francis emphasized a causal connection between globalization, widespread poverty, and environmental destruction. When I retired from OU, I was keenly aware that many of the same abuses that I saw overseas are happening right here in Appalachia, and especially right here in Athens County. My assigned topic for this testimony was public participation, and I can easily see that this is divided into 2 parts: the willing and unwilling participation of the public in decisions pertaining to these topics, to economic exploitation. Unwilling participation includes the use of tax money to subsidize fossil fuel production and to pay for cleanup and the resulting damage to waterways and infrastructure, while the benefits go to the state and industry. Southeast Ohioans are still dealing with the legacy of acid mine drainage for potentially centuries. So why should we now risk accepting millions of barrels of this unidentified toxic water injection in unmonitored wells simply because the state says so? Willing participation is different. It includes citizens' efforts to learn the facts and participate in the decision-making process. But here, the state and the industry have been obstructionist, as we've seen over and over in today's testimony. They refuse to disclose the chemicals used in fracking, and they use medical gag orders to prevent disclosures after accidents. These are just two examples of blatant violations of the people's right to know what is going on in their communities. Now, here's the main point I'm going to make. Despite the secrecy, despite all these efforts of the state and industry, there is solid evidence that the majority of Ohioans, or at least the ones we have met in Southeast Ohio, are not ignorant. Their knowledge and sense of alarm are becoming a major factor in the fracking debates. Their growing awareness is partly due to the efforts of concerned citizens, many of whom have been testifying today in this tribunal. Groups have worked tirelessly for years to educate the public and to demand from state representatives and agencies that they follow the laws to protect the people and the environment. Further evidence comes from our local politicians, both winners and losers in recent elections. All have voiced opposition to injection wells, including Democrats Debbie Phillips, Sarah Grace, Eddie Smith, Republican Jay Edwards, the Athens City Council resolution, Athens County Commissioner's resolution. The consensus clearly reflects the public's knowledge and widespread disapproval of injection wells. Even more tellingly, citizens in several Ohio cities have actually voted to ban fracking and injection wells outright, including Oberlin, Yellow Springs, Mansfield, Broadview Heights, Waterville, and Athens. Athens City passed its anti-fracking ordinance by an overwhelming margin of 78%. To account for this figure, it is necessary to assume that voters of all political persuasions are well aware of the dangers of fracking and injection wells. So what exactly is going wrong here? If we lived in a real democracy, it would be impossible for us not to get what we want through the power of the ballot box. It would be impossible for us not to get what we want through the power of the ballot box if we lived in a real democracy. Let me conclude with an observation about Article 19 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, 2007. Article 19 expressly secures for indigenous people the right to say no to industrial projects that may cause harms to them and the environment. However, this right is not universal, but is reserved for indigenous peoples. What are we to make of that in a discussion about human rights? The community rights movement interfaces with the International Declaration of Human Rights in an interesting way. Although both are about human rights and environmental justice, there are 2 points of difference that I will try to reconcile. First, in 1948, the Universal Declaration recognized the obligations of states to protect human rights and the environment without distinguishing among different types of government, be they democracies, monarchies, dictatorships, or colonial empires. Next, in 2007, the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples recognized that states have special responsibility with regard to indigenous peoples, namely the duty to ensure, this is one of them, duty to ensure that no hazardous materials, including the hazardous chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing and the flowback fluids that result from it, none of them shall be stored or disposed of on the lands of indigenous people without their free, prior, and informed consent. Of course, I agree with that. The community rights movement seeks to advance this same human right for all people everywhere, including indigenous people. Indigenous people are not singled out for special treatment, but rather serve as the model for the whole world. In conclusion, I suggest that in discussing human rights, it is at best incomplete to impose a double standard, however well-meaning it might be. In practical terms, it is not enough to badger governments simply to ensure that the industrial, manufacturing, and environmental conservation sectors are regulated in ways that are protective of citizens' health. It is necessary also, and this is what John and I have been talking about, it's necessary to badger them to take the next logical step, namely to avoid imposing environmental destructive development projects on all communities everywhere without their free, prior, and informed consent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Comments? Questions?
You mentioned indigenous people in this area. Who would that be?
Well, actually, it's been very much in the news about the Standing Rock Sioux. That's really the most prominent example today. Standing Rock Sioux, interestingly enough, Indians on reservations do not own the land. They occupy federal land. So the laws that apply to land ownership and the rest of it don't apply there. The indigenous people tend to talk about the sacredness of the land, the sacredness of the soil, the sacredness of the environment. And lo and behold, that seems to be a very useful concept. This declaration by the United Nations quite correctly recognizes that folks like this have a right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, even though they don't fall under the regular standard laws of the country. But in a sense, they fall under a higher law. It's a higher law to say that the land is sacred and that our rights are natural. They cannot be given or taken away. So, and then around the world, of course, indigenous populations are found in places like in the Amazon, where the dominant population is Spanish-speaking, but the indigenous folks are not. But interestingly enough, I lived in the Philippines for 3 years, uninterrupted. Everybody's indigenous in the Philippines, practically. I mean, there's a few visitors, you know. They distinguish between the Bumiputri, the sons of the soil and daughters of the soil, which means the Filipinos themselves, and then the Chinese and the Dutch and the Americans, everybody else is a visitor. But it's like 95% indigenous. Same with Indonesia, same with Malaysia. Most of these countries that were colonized, India, I mean, you know, how many million people are indigenous in India? So it's a kind of a funny dichotomy to say, well, we have this special rule for the indigenous people. Well, let's include the Filipinos there and say that they deserve to have a right of self-determination, and if they don't want fracking in their country, then they shouldn't have to have it if they vote against it. I mean, that's the basic principle. Now, how we work this out and what are the practical realities and what do we have to give up in order to get a step or two of progress, that's all a question of strategy. But our strategy is to take this approach that rights are inalienable and that they need to be fought for on a local level, and that if we get enough local level movements, then it becomes, eventually, you would see some success. But it's a battle.
Thank you.
So you're basically making a comparison, saying that we're the indigenous people.
In a sense, we are. I mean, the longer we stay here, we're indigenous, and who are the frackers? They're coming from Oklahoma, Louisiana, and some of them. Halliburton is now headquartered in Dubai. The so-called Halliburton exemption that we rail about, in 2005, U.S. Congress decides that the oil and gas industry are not subject to EPA laws. This is a Dubai company, so who's the indigenous people here?
Very good point.
You have been organizing here, I understand, along with your compatriot here. Have you heard about this new organization now that's forming called the Indivisibles? Have you had any contact with them?
Not contact yet, no. I'm interested. If we can find some more allies, that would be a good thing. I find all these groups to be, basically, the ones that are here at least, all working toward the same goal, and I would hope that indivisibles are the same.
So, do you have leaders in your group, or you are all equal, or what?
I've been elected the chair of the Bill of Rights Committee. John has been elected the coordinator of the Democracy Over Corporations. We rule only as long as we have the support of our group. Yeah. But we also have structural support. I mean, especially the community. The Bill of Rights Committee is a member of the Ohio Community Rights Network, and those cities that I mentioned have all passed ordinances against fracking or injection wells or both. We meet monthly. We have legal support from the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, which is really the parent organization for this, and it's a national movement. But also they've been active in Ecuador, in India. Recently there's another country that have been passing bills of rights locally and putting them into their constitution, which gives them another tool to fight corporations coming in and simply exploiting areas. It's a terrible imbalance because the corporations are so powerful. And as I pointed out, they're also supported by Western democracies, Western governments, U.S. government very much, especially in the 80s and 90s, all over Latin America, all over Southeast Asia, all over Africa, supporting economic development and causing a lot of havoc, a lot of chaos. I mean, including overthrow of governments. I mean, it's happened in Iran. It happened with Patrice Lumumba, with Arbenz in Guatemala. I mean, it's a scary story to look back and see what the United States has been doing in foreign policy since the 50s.
Now it's happening here.
And then we come home and we say, gee, what's the actual difference here between what's happening to us? I mean, there's a big difference. They're not throwing us in jail. I mean, I had students that just simply disappeared after protesting, never heard from again in the Philippines in the 70s. They don't do that to us here. They just ignore us. You know, where's the press? What kind of coverage are we going to get? And, you know, at least Athens is pretty good. I mean, this is actually a place where we do get attention, and we do get a lot of support from our local officials. But generally speaking, they handle, I mean, the system, the government, and the industry handle activists like ourselves by pretty much marginalizing us, propagandizing us, putting us, you know, and so that we have a hard time winning these battles. It's a difficult struggle. But as all the testimony here today has shown me, that people are not willing to give up, that they just keep fighting, and we have different strategies, and we just keep at it. We don't let them. We don't let them stop us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, appreciate it.
My name is Annie Burke. I live in Hockingport, Ohio, which is adjacent to Coolville and Torch. I grew up in Coolville, Ohio, so I've been a lifelong resident of Athens County. I am a registered nurse, and I have a bachelor's and master's degree, and I also have a bachelor's in education, and I have a bachelor's degree in nursing from Ohio University. And today I'm speaking out about my concerns regarding hydraulic fracturing waste. I am an educator and a nurse by background. I'm not an activist, but I care about the people in my community, and our community has had a history of contamination, and that has affected not only my friends and family, but my very close family. My aunt and my mother have both been affected by cancer from the C8 that was contaminated in the water from DuPont, the chemical plant that produces Teflon, when they dumped the C8 into the water for years. My brother possibly, even though he died before he was tested, his blood disorder may have also been a result of that. So we feel very strongly about taking care of our environment and the water that our families are drinking and bathing in and the air that we're breathing. I have a 9-year-old daughter who attends elementary school just a couple